Yes, screen. There we go. 30 already, brilliant. So I'll just give it a minute until it stops ticking up so quickly, and then we'll get started. All right, I think we can get started. The got a number of attendees in. It's not ticking up any faster, so I think that's about it. We might get some struggles coming in over the next couple of minutes, but I'll get started. All right, we'll be sharing this this poster on the social media afterwards, and it will be recorded, so you can have a chance to look at this in your own time. This just gives a bit of background as to our speakers, what the energy mix is at the moment, which will be important to talk about, some of the large and main energy projects that are in the works and will come onto the grid in the next few years, and some of the major energy policies that are within Australia and sort of shaping the energy industry at the moment. So we'll share this, and I'll give you a chance to look at that a little bit later. All right, well, brilliant. Thank you everyone for coming. This is our first webinar of our Grounded series, pardon the pun. My name is Alex, and I'm the chair of the Monash Energy Club. We're joined today by John O'Brien, Kane, Thornton, Peter Cowling, Chloe Munro, who I'll introduce a little bit later on. This webinar series is looking into Australia's energy future through the lens of these four experts. And of course, as most people here are probably Monash students, it's also a great chance for you to sort of get to meet and see the faces of some of the industry experts within Australia, and to learn a little bit more about the industry that you may be working in the next few years or over the next couple of decades. So your questions are more than appropriate and more than encouraged, and we'll try and answer as many as we can throughout. But I'll introduce our panelists. So first of all, we have Kane Thornton. Kane is the CEO at the Clean Energy Council, which is Australia's peak body that represents renewable energy, storage, and accredited rooftop solar installers. The Clean Energy Council works closely with governments, industry, and its members to increase demand for clean energy and to represent the industry. Next, we have Peter Cowling. Peter is the head of Australia and New Zealand's operations at Vestas. Vestas is the world's largest installer of wind turbines and is also one of the Monash Energy Club's key sponsors. Vestas has wind turbines spinning in over 80 countries, and was the first company to crack over 100 gigawatts of installed wind capacity worldwide, and I think has 16 farms currently within Australia. Peter may fact check me on that one. Next we have Chloe Munro. Chloe joined Monash in 2018 as a professorial fellow and has had more than a distinguished career in energy. She earned an international reputation for excellence in energy as chair of the Clean Energy Regulator, independent chair of AEMO, and panel member of the review into the future security of the National Electricity Market, more commonly known as the Finkel Review, which I think Chloe can talk a little bit about later on. And finally, we have John O'Brien, who is the current partner of Deloitte's decarbonisation and energy transition team, and has over 20 years of experience in the Australian energy sector. During this tenure, he has produced industry development plans for governments, published 2 books on the opportunities of decarbonisation, and is more than an expert, and I've heard the word founding father of clean energy tech in Australia. So thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a brilliant turnout from our attendees as well. As I was saying, there is a Q&A function, so we're welcoming in any and all of your questions. the way it'll work is that you can vote and comment on your favourite questions, and then our moderators will be able to see those. And we would like you to unmute yourself when you ask your question, sort of like an ABC Q&A sort of format. But of course, if you'd rather be muted, just let that be known when you ask the question. All right, well, I'll get started. And this is a question for, I guess, each panelist, and just to get the ball rolling. But I would like to know what each panelist sort of predicts the energy mix will be in the next 2 decades, and how will gas play, and how do you see the energy mix changing? Just a brief touch. I'll start with Chloe.
Well, thank you. Well, of course, forecasting is a mug's game, but I think there are some absolutely irresistible forces here. One is the rise of renewables, and the Finkel Review reported, it was just 3 years ago, and we got a lot of things right, but one of the things we got spectacularly wrong was how fast renewables costs, capital costs would continue to fall, and how rapidly renewables would continue to be adopted in Australia. And there's been some hiccups recently, but that's remarkable, and it's a pattern that's reproduced worldwide. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that for a variety of reasons, thermal generation is under increasing stress and performing poorly, and therefore will continue to surprise us with coal-fired power stations in particular being withdrawn from the market more quickly than their economic life would suggest. So that's the second thing. And I think the third thing is we'll have a much more sophisticated way of using resources because of digitisation, which will allow more participation on the demand side. So people not using energy, or managing when they use energy, and I'm talking particularly about electricity there. So that's going to really change the picture and allow electricity supply to be decarbonised pretty rapidly, which is very important. But of course, that's only a third of our emissions. So what happens to gas, you're right, is very significant. I think certainly gas has rather missed its moment in terms of being the transitional fuel for electricity generation, but displacing gas and liquid fuels and all the other uses in industrial uses and of course transport is more of a challenge. We're all very excited about hydrogen. In a year's time, hydrogen will, it'd be fantastic if it did. It'd be fantastic for Australia if we could have a hydrogen export industry that would replace our LNG industry. But I think there's a lot more question marks about that. So where the kind of rest of the fossil fuel consumption goes is a bit more of a question. And then of course it's coking coal for steel production, all of that, which potentially could be replaced by hydrogen. So there's a lot of open questions about, the kind of remaining 2/3 of our emissions and essentially the fossil fuels that sit behind it. But I just think the ability of people to solve, scientists and technologists to solve those problems is pretty remarkable. I'm quite optimistic that we can get to a really rapid decarbonisation over the next 20 years. Not 100, but getting quite close to net zero by 2050.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chloe. And I'm glad you brought up the transition fuel of gas, because this webinar is about the drivers of change. And we have seen most recently that the COVID Commission is considering, based on some leaked reports, that they are looking at natural gas to sort of be our transition fuel and to be our recovery. I'll pitch the same question to Kane, but I'd like if you could touch on what your opinions are of this gas-led recovery, and whether you agree with it or disagree with it, and whether you think we need that sort of transition fuel that Chloe mentioned.
If I can just chop in, I think there's real mixed messages about that. The transition fuel is about gas in electricity generation, and it's a really small amount of the gas that's used in Australia, let alone the gas that we exploit and export. So the COVID Commission really are talking about gas for manufacturing, and there's some very particular interests that have been quite vocal in that, who don't have a substitute at the moment. So I just think it's always worth thinking about the whole energy mix. It captures the imagination. We need gas to balance renewables. But that's not really what the COVID Commission is talking about.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Chloe.
Yeah, Alex, look, I think Chloe kind of nailed this, your bigger question in her response. And, I can only agree with her general sentiment that we're heading towards an energy system, and certainly an electricity system, that will be dominated by renewable energy and energy storage in the coming decade or two. And I guess to just give a bit of insight as to why we might have that confidence, if we look at what's happened just in the last couple of years here in Australia, and Chloe made reference to the cost reductions that have occurred just in the last 2 or 3 years have been pretty extraordinary. And I guess what that's done is fundamentally changed the economics and the outlook for the electricity sector in Australia. There is no doubt that the competition is over in terms of what will be meeting our electricity supply in the future. It's very clearly going to be renewables, and there's a very hot competition now between wind and solar, and in some parts of, which parts of the country and the specific characteristics of those two technologies differ. But very clearly we're heading towards an electricity system that will be absolutely dominated by wind and solar. And then I think the discussion gets into what are the other technologies and solutions around that, which I think partially goes to gas. I think very clearly gas has priced itself out of the electricity sector in Australia. It's playing a reducing role in the energy system to date. And I think, to Chloe's point, I think the current discussion about gas is really about its role in the broader sort of manufacturing industries as an input into some of those key processes. I don't think there's anyone genuinely thinks that gas is going to play a big and sustained role in the electricity system in Australia. It's just a matter of how quickly it phases out of that role. And I think the other factor, and I'm sure others will talk about this, is over the next couple of decades, I think we're really going to work through some of the sort of technical transition challenges that are in front of us right now, in terms of how much rooftop solar we can put in parts of the grid, how do we integrate, and connect large amounts of wind and solar. There's a lot of challenges there that I expect we'll come back and talk about. But we're really sort of at this very transformational phase, and therefore in a couple of decades ahead, to Chloe's earlier point, we'll really be making big inroads as far as electrifying other sectors, because the electricity sector is clearly where there's a lot of heavy lifting being done at the moment. There's enormous opportunity, and it's relatively easy compared to other sectors, and we'll really start to be shifting those other sectors onto renewable electricity. And then, of course, the big export opportunity. How can we help other countries take advantage of our extraordinary world-class renewable resources to indeed decarbonise their electricity and transport and other sectors as well?
Yeah. So are you, I can probably guess your answer, but you're a big proponent of electrifying Australia and removing gas completely?
Well, I mean, I think if you just look at what's happening as far as Australia's emissions at the moment, pretty well every sector of the economy, our emissions are trending upwards, with the exception of the electricity sector. The electricity sector emissions are trending downwards because we're pushing renewables in, because we're taking particularly coal, but also gas out of the system. And so if we want to reduce emissions in other sectors, clearly electricity is a really powerful, important, low-cost way to do that. If you look at transport as an example, very clearly, by electrifying the transport fleet is far and away the most cost-effective way we can make big inroads in reducing emissions, let alone the sort of broader economic benefits of an electrified transport system, and indeed the health benefits as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Kane. I'll pass it on to Peter. As Kane mentioned, we are still sort of wondering how much rooftop solar there can be and how much wind there can be in Australia. What's our peak wind almost? So what is sort of the potential of wind in Australia, and have we sort of just touched the surface of what we can do, or are we sort of starting to run out of those prime locations?
Yeah, it's a great question. I must admit, at various points along my 20-odd years in wind, I've thought, oh God, surely this is the last good one. Surely we've looked at all those ridges. Surely someone's got the map out and checked the topography and they've got the last of them. I see no realistic end, frankly. I'll try an analogy for you. The wind game has traditionally been stuck to the grid for obvious reasons. You don't want to have to extend the grid any more than you have to in terms of cost. But increasingly, as we look to renewables as a replacement for energy in general, whether it's through electrification or it's through conversion to chemical transport means, hydrogen, ammonia, or others, we're actually going to free ourselves up from that grid constraint. And then if you have a look at Australia, for example, we run a supercomputer model that finds resources. We had a quick look at Western Australia and South Australia, right? So off most of the traditional NEM, I actually literally said, don't touch the NEM segment. Found 1 million square kilometres of Australia that's got greater than 8.5 metres a second, which is kind of your holy grail. Don't want much more than that, or it's actually going to need smaller rotors, not bigger ones. And all of that with fantastic co-located solar resources. Now, frankly, the sky is the limit. Even within the NEM, for many years we thought, Queensland's sunny, but it's never going to have wind. The first 400 plus megawatt wind farm is now into final commissioning up there at Cooper's Gap. I know of 6,000 megawatts of wind projects now that are coming through the planning system up there. And that's not way up in far north Queensland. That's near Gladstone, near the existing grid. And again, it's the tip of the iceberg. The more you look, the more you find. And the technology is adapting so that, you don't need the perfect site. You can actually have a good solid site and that'll still get you a great yield. And finally, for those of us in Victoria, it's truly extraordinary what's happened in the last couple of years. Victoria's probably had more than any other state in terms of large-scale projects kick off. I think we're officially still sitting around 20-21% of generation in Victoria is renewable. You'll find that if the current tranche of projects that have been constructed even, and they're just waiting for their grid connection to go through, once they go through over the next 12 months, we'll be well over 40% of generation in Victoria, right? The home of brown coal. Too cheap to be worth moving more than 200 metres. We'll be at 45, pushing 50% within the next 2 or 3 years. It's amazing how quickly things can move once you get going. And I think to the broader point about transition and what's it going to look like, we sort of assume nice linear curves out to a genteel retirement of the old thermal capacity. I suspect it's going to be somewhat lumpier and more sudden and a damn sight quicker than that, based on what we're seeing at the moment. I suspect politically, culturally, you're going to look at burning in old coal-fired power stations in 10 years' time the way we look at smoking in a restaurant today. It's just not done. Like, it's just embarrassing to do it. And in a 40, 50-year-old plant, it's going to be dangerous to do it, right? Hazelwood didn't close because it was uneconomic. It closed because it was going to kill people. Right, really old gas pipes, steam pipes are really dangerous. So don't expect that stuff to hang in there till 2048. It'll move much faster, just as we adapted from horse-drawn to car really fast. Once you get going, it's very hard to stop the bleeding obvious.
Yeah, I will say that I think AEMO's ISP updated version just came out, and they are planning for. Well, I think their optimal path. Plans for the shutdown of coal thermal plants at the time that they were expected to retire. So it's great to hear a little bit of disagreement with AEMO once in a while.
Alex, and it's worth noting, I mean, every time AEMO investigate this issue, every time they look at what the expectation is around the phase out of coal, their expectation changes dramatically, and that's their way of saying the reliability of these plants just continues to go downwards, and every time they look at it, therefore, they bring forward their expectations as to how much coal is going to close, how quickly. And I think that just reinforces Pete's point about coal is going to come out fast when it it's starting to happen now, and I think it's only going to speed up.
And perhaps if I think pick up on the way Kane introduced the topic. It's not what is the solution. It's very, we know exactly what the solution is. It's going to be a mix of wind and solar, and by the way, they're highly complementary, particularly in Australia. It's frankly just how fast is that going to happen, and probably the answer to that is around how we manage the grid. So it's about how we manage the connection process, how we manage the market even going forward, as we move from a predominantly sort of cost of generation based system to a nil cost of generation system. How do we manage that dispatch? So there's a bunch of challenges that we'll need to nut out over the next five to 8 years, I'd say. But beyond that, we'll move pretty damn fast. And I think Chloe's right. I think gas has probably missed its opportunity as the transitional fuel. If you were going to invest today in a gas turbine, typically you'd want to know you've got good 20 years use to come out of that. I can't see 20 years use in a machine that starts operating in 3 years' time. It's not going to be operating in the mid-40s. You're much better off putting that into forms of storage and grid management and the rest of it. So certainly a role for existing gas, maybe for recycled gas turbines and the rest of it. But brand new kit planning for a 20-year life, good luck funding it.
All right, now I do want to get John in here before we go to a audience question. As our decarbonisation expert and publisher, what other sort of things do we need to be looking at in order to decarbonise our energy industries, our energy mix, I should say? We've been hearing about renewables, but is there anything else that we should be focusing on?
Yeah, certainly, and I'd go back to Chloe's point about being an optimist. I'm a stubborn optimist, so I've got absolutely no doubt that we are going to decarbonise rapidly over the next decade, and certainly the decade after that. I think net zero is going to be 2040, not 2050. The science will change as AR6 comes out, and we're going to have to do things more quickly. I do think coal is absolutely going to come out of the system much earlier than some people are modelling. We have our own energy market model, and our view is it's coming out much more rapidly. And just before I get to sort of some of the other solutions, I think it's really important to think around pricing. So just from an economic point of view, why wouldn't you do renewables? Because it's cheaper and that's good. But actually thinking about, what are the drivers sort of a little bit upstream of that? There has been some government support, and I'm sure we'll get to government, and the state governments are doing some good work at the moment on pushing ahead. But more importantly, and so I've kind of been around for a while, as the other speakers have, we do a lot of work for a lot of big consumers, so energy consumers. And the conversation has changed entirely over the last couple of years with big energy consumers. So the big miners, the big industrials, big manufacturing, oil and gas. You're no longer talking to the sustainability manager who kind of wants to do something because that's their job. You're talking to the CFO, the CEO, and presenting to the board because they're under massive investor pressure to start decarbonising their companies. If they want BlackRock and other big investors to actually spend any money on them, they have to have a decarbonisation plan. There was a lithium miner called, I think, Pilbara Minerals, which last week got some funding out of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and one of the conditions of that funding was that they put in place a net zero plan, for instance, and other sort of private investors are doing the same thing. So the companies are continuing to decarbonise, and renewable energy obviously being the easiest and the quickest and the first cab off the rank. And that's driving a lot of the development that's happening, and corporate PPA is an area which is continuing to increase really, really rapidly. So in some ways, as I said, we will get to government, and this is going to happen regardless of government, because actually the big companies need it to happen. to satisfy their investors. And the really interesting bit that's only really come through in the last probably few months is those big mining companies, for instance, and we sort of do sort of the global decarbonisation strategies for some of the big guys there. They're actually starting to see it through their supply chains. So if you're supplying battery minerals, for instance, the battery manufacturers are saying, oh, do you have any carbon neutral lithium? Because we're going to have a carbon neutral battery, because Mercedes is starting to ask for a carbon neutral battery that they can put in their carbon neutral electric vehicle. And it comes all the way back down through the supply chain. So that again changes the conversation, rather than the investor relations people going, oh, we've got some investors being a pain and we've got to do something. We've now got the sales guys saying, someone's just asked me if we've got any green stuff. Has anyone got any green stuff? What is this? Can we decarbonize? How do we do that? So that's driving massive uptake of renewables. And then the hard to abate sectors. So hydrogen, is it bioenergy? So we've been doing a lot of modeling for ARENA at the moment on potential for bioenergy and really having another look at that. How do you decarbonize flight? That's really hard to electrify. Hydrogen's probably pretty hard. Maybe it's dropping biofuels is the way to go there. So there's a lot of electrification. Absolutely, that's the starting point. Electrifying everything actually has its challenges as well. We've got to have massive upgrade in infrastructure. We've got to have big interconnectors. Maybe we've got to have a lot more substations if all the energy is being electrified. So there are some challenges there, but then how else do we decarbonize on transport, on agriculture, and obviously in manufacturing, and where gas is almost a chemical feedstock rather than an energy feedstock.
Yeah, wow, brilliant to hear this. Pressure from both sides, and we may not have to wait on a slow government to to get everything rolling. Now we'll jump to an audience question. Rachel or Pradnya, is there anything that's in the chat that or anyone that you want to unmute?
Yes, so we've got a few questions about meeting peak demand. I'm gonna just unmute Nicola so she can ask her question. Yeah, Nicola, go for it.
Hi everyone, thanks for taking my question. My question is pretty much, considering we cannot handle the current peaks entering the energy system in Australia, do you think it's unwise for Australians to be encouraged to implement solar personally before we can even handle the peaks in production that we currently have? And also, how do you think we can move forward without upgrading how much energy the grid can accept?
Well, I can pick on somebody, or somebody can volunteer. Chloe?
I think that question is slightly based on false premises, because actually right now we handle the peaks pretty well. It's very rare that we actually have a problem. But in fact, we're having more problem with the troughs, which is really when, when rooftop solar's going full blast, and the market price plunges, and that causes all sorts of issues to do with the way that our electricity market is designed. So there's lots of issues about reforming the electricity market that would help with that. But in terms of the peak, I mean, first of all, there's lots of ways of reducing the peak that we need to work harder on. Energy efficiency would be a good one. That reduces everything, not just the peak. We've talked about demand side management briefly, which is the idea that you can turn down your energy use at those peak times. You can be rewarded to do that, or you can, you shift that energy use to different times of day. And then the third main thing is storage, and there was a question about that as well. So there's lots of opportunities to do better on storage. We've got lots of storage, in refrigeration and hot water and so on, that we could use more effectively. That's part of the demand side story. There's battery prices are coming down very quickly, but there's other forms of storage, chemical storage as well. And there on the Monash campus, you've got a flow machine, which is vanadium based and is, fantastic technology. And there's flywheels, and there's, to say nothing of pumped hydros. Well, so when you add all of those things up, what we're really talking about is that the economic incentives for those things. John mentioned network and having networks in the right place so that you can move energy around more effectively, so you can take advantage of those more intermittent renewables. If you have all of that moving forward together, then we could certainly absorb a lot more renewables in the grid in very short time. So I don't actually think rooftop solar per se is a problem that can't be dealt with almost immediately. I do agree in a sense, the incentives are all very focused on renewables without all these other things, but I don't think it's difficult to shift the dial a bit on that, and that is starting to happen at a policy level. Personally, I would say, well, if you're thinking of installing rooftop solar, don't hold off because you're worried about destabilising the grid at peak times. I think that's the least of your worries, really.
All right. Well, thank you, Nicola. Now, I do want to move on to policy, and as John said, we're not needed, but it's still an important part of of the energy transition. I'm hoping to hear from, I guess, Peter about some of the policies that you want that would support your industry a little bit more, support the wind industry more, or something that's in place at the moment that's sort of hindering, in your opinion, the transition.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So, to kick off by saying policy is not a bad thing in this space. I think the renewable energy target, frankly, has been a runaway success. It was always a competitive measure. It was never a feed-in tariff just handed out to folk. It's actually I think it's one of the driving reasons why we're such a competitive sector, and why for the last 3 or 4 years we've motored on to the biggest installed numbers we've ever had without any policy at all, pretty much. So A, policy is good. B, obviously we do have a policy vacuum, at least on a federal level. And where I think it could really help is this harder stuff. Individual projects can certainly be kicked off purely on their economic merits, right, on their commercial merits. And as John pointed out, the corporate PPA market is exploding. Any decent-sized corporate with an energy demand has to be in this space now. Where we need help is the complicated stuff, the balancing of the grid, the installation of storage, for example, where it's so much harder to stack up a case for storage from a financial sense. So running it as an arbitrage is something you might see in the short term, but banking on a long-term arbitrage is very, very difficult. Other markets have solved this. Go to Israel. There's a storage incentive which has seen a couple of gigawatts of pumped hydro built. This can be done, but you need an actively engaged government, which unfortunately we don't have on a federal level, and we do have on a piecemeal state level. It would be fantastic if they could all join together and actually plan out some of this stuff. Definitely needed well, we are starting to see some demand management come through, which is fantastic. I'd agree with the previous answer about peaks. The last lot of peaks was quite effectively dealt with. We didn't go near using up all of the reserve capacity that AEMO had pulled together. But going forward, that gets harder every time. The more intermittent resources that we have, so it needs planning. Planning for this transition, not planning for this transition is a bit like sort of trying to use the market to dispatch emergency services. You'd never do that, right? You'd plan the dispatch of emergency services to the most needed. That's what we need to do to plan the future grid. The expertise is there. We just need some focus.
Right. All right. Thank you. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned batteries and the storage. AEMO's ISP suggests that we need 6 to 19 gigawatts of dispatchable resources, which could come through batteries, hydrogen, or even gas. Can you see a future, or do you agree with the future that by 2040 we'd have upwards of 19 gigawatts of batteries or hydro?
Oh, conceivably, yes, absolutely. The bigger challenge is just how do they make money? What is the opportunity there? And depending on the type of storage, the money is not there at the moment.
more famous batteries you hear of out there are typically making their money out of F-gas, out of frequency control, which is not the same as shifting energy. But again, I think we need to review how our dispatch-based market works for energy, but also look at how you then incorporate storage incentives into that. There will certainly be an overbuild, but overbuild alone won't get you there. Eventually, I would expect transport to come to the table here. You know, we should have vehicle to grid and vice versa, which should unlock massive potential for storage without even needing a specific incentive. But in the meantime, I think we need to get cracking. I look to state governments as an opportunity to really bolster their state security, if you like, by pushing local state storage incentives.
Alex, if I can just add, the Clean Energy Council tracks the rate of commitments to batteries here in Australia, and we just recently closed off the last 6 months analysis, and what it showed is in the last 6 months, just in the large scale battery market, the level of commitments doubled from what they've been historically. And there was about 0.5 gigawatt of large-scale energy storage committed just in the last 6 months alone. And so what that says to you is that target of 6+ gigawatts is imminently achievable. But I guess to Pete's point, the real challenge is around the investment certainty, given the level of market and policy uncertainty. It's a common story we see in the sector. Investors are committed and prepared and have got a strong appetite for putting private capital into renewable energy, wind farms, solar farms, and energy storage. But they need to have some level of comfort around their future revenue and ultimately what the future policy and market looks like to underpin those investments, and particularly in an environment where there's hundreds of other countries around the world who, frankly, are working harder than we are here in Australia to provide that sort of certainty to investors. And so it's a very competitive marketplace. Investors have a lot of different countries that they can put their valuable finances into, and Australia is a great place to invest, but we can't be complacent about that.
Yeah, and were those that half gigawatt, was that small scale or large scale? You said
that's just in large scale, so just in the utility scale battery commitments. They're projects that have reached financial commitment and are now in some stage of construction and will come online certainly before we expect before the this coming summer.
Right, and is it sort of looking like our storage will come from everyone owning Teslas and putting them back into the grid, or is it going to be that large scale battery storage?
Look, I think it'll be a bit of everything. I think it's very difficult to predict. You know, certainly, I mean, with 2.5 million Australian homes have got rooftop solar. You know, there's a real, I think, appetite from Australians to have some control over their energy supply and production, and so I think we're just starting to see a real uptick in the rate of households going to batteries. You know, I think the anxiety around the summer and the bushfires that we had, I think even COVID-19 creates some anxiety amongst people that will probably drive them towards solar and particularly batteries. So we're expecting household batteries to play a role. We're also expecting utility scale batteries to grow quite quickly. And then other forms of energy storage. You know, we've mentioned things like pumped hydro and better using our existing hydro infrastructure. You know, it has enormous potential. It's proven technology, but these are big, complicated investments, and investors need to have some level of confidence in the policy and market settings in a way that that I think as a country we could do better.
Now, Alex, just on the economics of batteries is also going to change fairly rapidly over the next, sort of 5 or 10 years as the pricing comes down. So, and that's just for lithium, but there's plenty of other technologies as well. So, by the time we get to the end of the decade, I would say arbitrage probably does stack up on its own. It doesn't at the moment. We've done plenty of modelling on that. It doesn't work on its own, but the price is coming down, as rapidly as it has done with solar. So we'll see that get more competitive.
All right. Well, thanks, John. We'll take another audience question. Rachel, if there's anything that's standing out for you.
Yeah, so we had a question based on how they're going to integrate the renewables into the grid. So we had a question from Gary. Gary, I'm just going to unmute you now so that you can ask a question to the panelists.
Thanks, Rachel. Thanks to the grid. Thanks to the panelists for taking this question. So my question's in regards to grid strength and need for new transmission infrastructure in Australia. It's one of the, I guess, major issues that we're facing with new renewables coming online and trying to connect to the grid. And I was wondering if you could each perhaps share some updates or perspectives on how you think AEMO and the public and private sector are currently working on these issues at hand. Is there a coordinated effort, or are we still struggling to meet our new I guess, new installments of renewables with transmission and, I guess, grid issues causing us to fall behind?
All right, thanks, Gary.
Well, perhaps I could kick that one off, because I mean, this was really the fundamental preoccupation of the Finkel review, was how to pay attention to all those other characteristics of the grid that allow renewables to be integrated at increasing scale. So this is really about the keeping voltage and frequency within reasonable bands and being able to keep supply and demand in balance, so the system doesn't just completely go out of whack and start damaging equipment that's attached to it. So that's the guts of it. So the Energy Security Board was set up as recommended by the Finkel Review to advance, if you like, implementing those recommendations, and a lot of it's happening below the surface and hasn't quite got implemented yet, but they are making quite significant inroads. And one of the main recommendations that we made was around the integrated system plan, which has already been referred to, which the energy market operator has been doing, and the creation of renewable energy zones. And that's really picked up in the last few months, particularly New South Wales promoting its proposed renewable energy zones. And there's some acceleration, I think, of processes around new transmission links to support that. So it's still frustratingly slow. But I think what we'll see is quite a lot of that crystallise in the next 12 months, and that will give us some better outcomes than we've seen so far. On other aspects, the market design, which is really about the incentives which both Peter and John have talked to, where you get rewarded for dispatchability and you get rewarded for things that strengthen just performance of the system as well as for energy. There is a very big project going on what's called the post-2025 market design project. We're yet to see to what extent that is a really kind of radical revision of the way the electricity market operates. Because at the moment it relies on a short-term price signal, very short-term, both to do three things. It relies on it to dispatch the lowest cost energy, electricity at any particular minute. It relies on it to provide a signal for long-term investment, and it relies on it to operate the system securely by applying certain constraints. And that's really asking way too much. So some pretty significant, in my view, reforms need to be made to that. So I think progress is being made, but at the same time, we have some frustrating gaps. And of course, the biggest frustrating gap we have is, not an overarching transition plan that includes an emissions reduction trajectory. States have goals and objectives, but at sort of an integrated federal level, there isn't anything to help guide that, and that's a major gap. But on the operational side, coming together, and finally, in terms of private investment, I mean, there's some things that you can't really very easily invest in privately, and one of them is network enhancement. Theoretically, it can be done, but there's incredible hurdles to how you can get to a position where you actually get your money back. So that really does rely on government policy to get that moving.
All right, great. Thank you, Chloe. And thank you, Gary. I might actually open up to one more question, just because there's quite a few in the chat. Rachel or Pradnya, if you can pitch another one.
Yeah, so we have a question from Prakash at the moment that is kind of looking more at EV technology and transportation in the future. So I will just unmute Prakash now. Yeah, if you want to just ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, basically my question is from this decarbonization perspective, because at the moment transport sector contributes quite a lot in terms of emission. So since globally hydrogen fuel cell and EVs are growing up, so from experts' perspective, how do you see that maybe within next 5 to 10 years, the transport sector will shift, like in Australia, that will the share of EVs and hydrogen fuel cell vehicle will be significant, or yeah, I would like to ask that question.
All right, thanks Prakash. I'd also recommend you come watch our webinar next week, which is all about that. But I might chuck that one to John, who's our clean tech expert.
Yeah, certainly. So yeah, Australia's a bit behind on some other places at the moment on terms of thinking about decarbonising transport. So I do think we're going to pick up fairly rapidly over the next little while. The economics are starting to improve for EVs, particularly. They're still not in the market. I think one of the challenges has been, there's a lot of culture in Australia about, everyone has to own a car, if not 3, and it's sort of actually having that ownership rather than, I think also as we see more share models coming in terms of you don't actually need to have a garage with a car in it, you've got access to a car that just is parked in your road. I think that'll help as well. So in terms of, there's some very different bits of transport as well though, and there'll be different solutions for different niches. So I think in terms of commuter cars, it's hard to see EVs not dominating that. Hydrogen, economics of hydrogen just is a fair way from where EVs are, and EVs is actually accelerating more quickly at the moment. I think it's hard to see hydrogen vehicles being driven around the cities that much. Some of the sort of return to base freight, heavier goods, that's possible. We're doing some work currently on forklift fleets, and that there's the economics there can work for hydrogen fairly effectively. And then particularly where you've got really heavy transport, so cross country, where you get greater range, potentially hydrogen's in that. As I said at the beginning, so certainly airlines, how do you decarbonise flights? Really hard to electrify, really hard to put hydrogen there. The other bit is also biofuels, and it's had a checkered history in Australia. And I remember I think it was about 2006, everyone was very excited and spent a lot of money on biofuels, and mostly lost all their money. There's more opportunities coming in that, and there's some new technologies coming through, and I do think as we strive to decarbonise, and that's the reason we're looking at things. I think we'll see biofuels also having niches there as well. So there's a mix, and I think with any of this decarbonisation and actually energy transition, there's no silver bullet, and there'll be solutions for niches, and there'll be a lot of different solutions out there that will end up sort of mixing in together.
Now, I know that Prakash is a big supporter of hydrogen, and it's something that I'm somewhat interested in as well. Can you see, you've mentioned that it's probably not going to be the transit vehicle future, but can you see a sort of hydrogen economy, or it being used to back up renewables in place of batteries, or do you think batteries has got a bit of a leg over it?
So we've done a lot of modelling on hydrogen and hydrogen forecasts over the last 2 years. We did all the work for the National Hydrogen Strategy, and we've been working on a lot of the export projects that are being mooted. So I reckon 2 years ago I was a complete skeptic. I thought there's no role for hydrogen whatsoever. It's just like, what the hell, this is, biofuels was 15 years ago, hydrogen was about 20 years ago, surely. And my view is absolutely there's going to be quite a large role for hydrogen, because there are some solutions that you can't electrify effectively. So, and if you just sort of start from, where is the additional value? So Chloe mentioned making steel and replacing coking coal. Hydrogen is pretty much the only thing you can do that. Are we going to do it in Australia? Maybe, who knows? But also making ammonia, making explosives, anywhere where you've got sort of a chemical feedstock of hydrogen, we're going to have to green that, and we're going to need renewables to actually make that. So that will generate some scale of hydrogen production, and then you can start using other uses and looking at heavy transport. There's also the gas pipeline sector, and biogas is probably a little easier than hydrogen, to be honest. But they need to protect the value of their pipes. As they decarbonise, you're not going to be able to put fossil fuel methane in it. You're going to have to put some other gas in there. So there's billions of dollars of assets that potentially have write-downs unless you can put a different gas, a decarbonised gas, through those pipes. So they are going to invest into alternate solutions to manage their asset values. And so that will also drive some scale, and we're seeing that already with some of the pipeline guys. So hydrogen is absolutely going to have a big future. We're not going to have a hydrogen economy. We're going to have niches where hydrogen is really useful, and then some sort of flow-on uses as well, would be my view.
All right, brilliant. Thanks, John, and thank you, Prakash. Now, I think I'll ask just sort of a wrap-up question before we go to a few more audience questions. But quite a few people here. Actually, we have another hydrogen question. May as well go into that. Pradney, if you want to ask that.
Yeah, so actually, since we're touching upon the topic of hydrogen, we have another quite a good question from Wendy. So Wendy, I'm just going to unmute you and you can ask your question. You go, Wendy.
Yeah, thanks. I was actually listening to the Smart Energy Council's webinar, ministerial webinar, the other day, and the Minister for Energy of South Australia was definitely indicating that they're going to be doing some curtailment of renewable energies in the short term or the next year. So I guess my view is, to what extent can we put in place potentially pilots or examinations, feasibility into large-scale green hydrogen in particular? What's people's views on that?
I'm happy to start on that. Hydrogen is expensive. So if you build a plant, you really need to utilise it as much as you possibly can, ideally, pretty close to 100% of the time, because you've just spent a lot of capex building that plant. If you're just relying on where you get curtailed renewable energy, you're going to be using it for maybe 20% of the time, and the economics gets a lot harder. It doesn't mean it doesn't help, and co-locating with, renewable energy zones and energy parks certainly makes sense, because you can then benefit from where you can't use the energy elsewhere, but it won't on its own make hydrogen economic where it wasn't.
That's a really good point, John. I certainly think early early schemes to put electrolysis systems out there will have to be grid connected, and typically their best case will be use surplus at midday and windy times. We actually see, obviously there's a huge cost and waste premium for conversion to hydrogen. But when you first look at that, you go, you have that, this just doesn't sort of make sense. The flip side of that, the thing that hydrogen unleashes is scale and location, right? So whereas previously you had to jam your wind farm, solar farm in near suburban Australia or occupied Australia, let's say, where you're inherently coming into conflict with other uses for the land and with planning issues and all the rest of it, and grid issues, frankly. The transportability of hydrogen means that, frankly, you can look at just chasing the best resource. Bit the way the oil and gas industry has always just chased the best yielding gas wells, right? That's not necessarily the ones closest to the petrol station at all. So you can actually, we know that electrolysis has to come down in cost, and we sort of expect a lot of that to happen just through scale of manufacture, and there'll be technology improvements, as we've seen in every other key renewable technology angle. But frankly, the other thing people are perhaps forgetting about when they look at that cost trend is what can happen to renewables when you're released of marginal loss factors and grid constraints and planning disputes and all the other nonsense, right? Back to my 1 million square kilometres of Western Australia and South Australia, if I can build at a gigawatt at a time and I have certainty that I have an economic proposition that lasts 30 plus years, because I'm not worried about the next policy change in the NEM, I'm actually thinking about a global energy trade, then frankly, my cost of money comes down, my scale goes up, I'm not worried about noise and neighbour complaints or any of that stuff anymore. I'd actually rather bank on the cost of wind coming down from 45 bucks Aussie now to 20 bucks, right? There's your halving already. You can pump it offshore as hydrogen. So I think it's enormously exciting future for Australia. I totally agree. It's not going to be commuter transport. It may not even be any form of transport, frankly. I think that the batteries are moving so fast. But as a way, as an industrial fuel, we think it's actually got a huge place for a bunker fuel replacement if you flip it to ammonia. So the shipping industry is the great dirty secret of the world at the moment. Frankly, we burn stuff that should never be taken out of the ground. It should be pumped back in as our shipping fuel. That's got to change urgently. Hydrogen is part of that path. Yeah, and what are the transitional projects? Everything. Anything that gets another electrolysis device out there, bearing in mind that there's only a couple of hundred megawatts of electrolysis in the whole world at the moment, and a lot of those are from the 1920s in Scandinavia. We just need to turn it up to 11, try a bunch of different schemes the way we have on batteries, electric cars, wind and solar. And I think you'll find within 5 to 10 years, we'll have a massive industry around us.
Alex, it's worth noting, I mean, two of the biggest renewable energy projects anywhere in the world are currently being planned in northern parts of Australia. And, these are projects that are just extraordinary in terms of their scale. They're right here in Australia, so we should be very proud of that. They take advantage of our incredible renewable resources, particularly solar. They're tens of gigawatts in scale, which is even quite hard to even imagine what that looks like. But they're extraordinary projects that are really focused on setting Australia up and take advantage of our export potential. I think there's still a race on and tension between how do we get this renewable energy out to market? Is it by condensing it and processing it into hydrogen or some other fuel? Is it via very long distance underwater high voltage cables? Maybe it'll be both for different markets in different parts of the world. But it's incredibly inspiring, and there's these aren't just science fiction ideas. These are now getting big backing from serious investors to progress these projects, and it's pretty inspiring, and it signals towards an extraordinary opportunity for Australia if we can get it right.
All right, well, thank you all, and thank you, Wendy, for that question. I'll ask my final question, which I think most of the audience will be interested in hearing about. Our audience is mainly students, and talking about careers now is probably more interesting than it's ever been, because it's more up in the air about how it actually, what sort of economy are we about to walk into. Most people are about to graduate, and frankly, probably pretty nervous about what they're about to enter. But what would you say are some of the opportunities that are arising in the energy industry that a young graduate, maybe an engineer, maybe an IT student should be looking into? Oh, pardon me. That they should be looking into, and where should they be seeking employment? Who wants to take this one first?
Grid. Grid. Do your power systems engineering, SCADA design, any smarts to do with integration of networks. we frankly, if it wasn't for COVID, we'd still be flying jumbo loads of that skill set into Australia. Most extraordinary international cohort of engineers working on it, literally from around the world, given that Australia probably has the greatest challenges on grid connection at the moment of any economy. So please do power systems engineering. It wasn't a very cool course up until recently. It is a cool course. It's amazingly intellectually rigorous form of engineering, but it's got an absolutely real world outcome. Coming out of the back of that, anyone who's got software skills that relate to it, I couldn't even, PSCAD is this extraordinary new software package we all rely upon. Good old PSSE, Fortran. They're all really, really critical skills now for the industry. I'd still say, we look out for engineers with a bit of commercial. We look for, lawyers with a bit of engineering. In the commercial end of what we do, there's no end of those sorts of people. But frankly, if we could double the number of grid engineers today, there wouldn't be enough.
Alex, we recently did a piece of research looking to answer this question. What are the skill sets we need both today and deep into the future under a range of scenarios? And there were 4 areas that stood out to me. Pete's picked up on one of them. The grid piece is very obvious. The construction project managers, there's an enormous construction pipeline underway at the moment and coming long into the future. So that was another area. Qualified electricians, whether that's about rooftop solar or a lot of electrical work out on large scale projects. And the other one, which is the final one, which is quite dear to my heart. I actually did my undergraduate at Monash in IT, and I think the reality is now that there's so much of the energy sector being digitized in so many ways. I mean, a lot of the conversation we've had is about the incredible sort of complexity and sophistication between renewable energy technology, a complex energy market, and a consumer and customer who wants to play a role in all of that, and how we get our control systems, our grid interfaces, our customer interface, how we get all of that working, I think is a really rich area that will be a big focus over the coming many decades. So I think they're the key areas for me.
If I can chip in with a couple of others, certainly following on from that, the data sciences generally, modelling is still an enormous need for, and artificial intelligence and all of those areas, which is really having much smarter ways of anticipating in the short term how you integrate different knowledge sources. So that's one, and that fits in with control systems as well. But it's more than that. The other one I think we shouldn't forget is that there's a lot of, whenever you're building infrastructure, there's a lot of community interaction that needs to happen. And any of the major changes that you see, there's a lot of the transitional issues are simply human issues. So I think, the behavioural sciences, but also just really good relationship skills. Of course, I mean, that in the biz and sales and marketing, but there's a whole load of areas where being able to communicate and explain things and bring people with you and also respond genuinely to their concerns is a huge thing. So it's also the human side of this is pretty enormous in my view, and I think there will be quite a lot of opportunities around that as well.
John, do we need more clean tech entrepreneurs, or should we leave that to Silicon Valley?
No, there's stacks in Australia of clean tech entrepreneurs, but so just thinking about sort of our team at Deloitte, so in the graduates and the early stage career people, we've got a real mixture of, so it's people with technical skills and commercial skills, so it's kind of at the commercial end that Peter was saying. We've got economists, we've got lawyers, we've got engineers, some really serious data visualization people, people who manage SQL databases and do the data manipulation and modeling out of that, the financial modeling people. So there's a range of different skills that are actually needed, as well as sort of the hard engineering that to actually make the things work. Actually, there's a plethora of stuff that you need behind it to make it all actually operate commercially and sensibly. So if you're interested in this sector and you are going to have a booming career over the next decade, I would strongly suggest, because it's not slowing down. It's been accelerating for 20 years, and it's continuing to accelerate with the occasional bump.
All right, well, thank you. I think we've got time for one more audience question, a quick one. So I'll go to Pradnya.
Yeah, so we actually have a couple of Monash cohort in the audience, and I think Roger has one of the questions. Roger, go.
Thanks very much. I mean, we've actually covered this a little bit, but maybe even go into a bit more detail about how are we going to cope with the variability in renewables. And this could be with storage, transmission, curtailment, demand side management, or are there other tools in the toolbox?
Peter?
Yeah, look, forecasting is getting better all the time, Roger. Particularly very short-term forecasting, which is needed for grid balancing purposes. We've got an initiative out there at the moment, one of the several funded by ARENA, that seems to have significantly improved on the previous dispatch system, so that should go public soon. That's a really critical one. I think the other interesting thing that's happening a lot, certainly in the wind space, is folks are looking to optimize machines for when you most want the generation. So, for example, a machine that is all megawatts, so that tops out at full wind speed, is increasingly perhaps being tuned down a bit in its attractiveness by investors, saying, well, when it's blowing there, it'll be blowing pretty much everywhere else in that node of the market. And therefore, that generation is simply not worth as much. So I'm more interested in the bottom end of the power curve, right? So you're looking at people actually oversizing machines for a given wind regime in order to optimize yield at times of day when it's going to be more valuable. So they're kind of interesting tricks on the traditional just get your megawatt hours out, which made sense back in a RET certificate-based sort of incentive. Now what you're interested in is the best bang for buck, and that's going to be tweaking your generation for where the market weaknesses are, i.e. that barely windy day when any generation be worth some good money.
And my view on that is all of the above, clearly, but I think demand management is the glue that actually holds everything together. You've got all these bits of kit, generating, storing, and demand management has to be the flex that actually allows it all to work. And I think we'll just see massive growth in that over the next decade.
Thanks very much. Right, and thanks, Alex, for putting together a great show.
Thank you, Roger. Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but it is a top-rated question. Just super quickly, nuclear, pro or con? Who wants it in Australia? Hands up.
Alex, there are still people who want it. I've spent a lot of time on this issue in my role as a fellow of the Academy of Technology and Engineering, and there's some quite serious advocates there. And in fact, I gave evidence at the latest Senate inquiry into the topic. So that was, to me, it's just simple economics. From a safety point of view, really, when you look at it, nuclear is much safer than coal. It really is. And people get very excited about the idea of small modular reactors being more responsive and dispatchable and all of that. But I look at the economics and I just think, if it was ever a viable option in Australia, which it never was socially, it certainly isn't now. And if we did have it, it would be so niche, it wouldn't be worth worth putting the effort into all the things you'd have to do to make it possible in Australia. So not for us would be my short answer to the question.
Great, thanks, Doug.
I'm keen for it to be allowed, yes. Because I wanted it to have a chance to be proven on its own merits, right? Yeah. The first tranche of nuclear 40, 50, 60 years ago was all heavily military subsidised, right? Completely different paradigm. Let it rip, so long as it meets its safety standards, and if it can do so, actually it could be a valid part of the solution as far as I'm concerned. I just don't think it will be. Yeah. I absolutely don't think it will be. It hasn't got a hope in hell from the experience we see out there unsubsidized nukes trying to get started. And you look at what they have to do. Like we think we're pretty clever putting our turbines up 110 meters in the air and rah, rah, rah. You look at what they have to do. It's no wonder it's hard. It really is no wonder it's hard. We can just roll out wind turbines and solar and batteries so much faster than they can. And we don't have to worry about all the stuff they have to worry about on the side. So I say let it rip, so we take the controversy out of this issue.
And I'd absolutely agree with that. And but having arrived in Australia 20 years ago, there's a sort of a level of hypocrisy in Australia in that we're, we can't have nuclear, but we're quite happy to dig up that uranium stuff and sell it to other people because, well, they're foreigners, so it doesn't matter. So if we're digging up uranium and selling it to other people, then it's hypocritical. It's wrong if we're not actually saying we can use that uranium ourselves. And actually, I think a responsible government would actually lease its uranium if it thinks it's dangerous, and it would continue to own it and take it back and then put it back where it came from, rather than giving it away. And the other, just slightly related, and because Ariel always has a go at me for talking about this, there is a role for CCS going forward as well. It's kind of another topic you can't talk about. It's not to prop up coal-fired power stations. It is to help with industrial decarbonisation and then eventually draw down because we're going to need it. So CCS is still a player in the game and will be one of the big pieces long term, I think.
Alex, if I can just add, I know we're short on time. This has been a great discussion and initiative, but I think there's been a real lack of disagreement amongst your panelists. So I'm going to say I strongly disagree with the other three panelists, and I think that having any more bloody inquiries or changing legislation or anything else to do with nuclear is a total waste of time because it's priced out of the market. It's never going to play a role. And if I could capture all of the time and energy we've wasted as a country talking about nuclear and direct it towards some of the issues and challenges we've discussed today, then we'd be a whole lot further progressed as far as the transition to a renewable energy and energy storage future.
I agree with you, Kane. People misunderstand. Policy capacity is a very scarce resource. So, why direct it to try and solve a problem that won't actually do anything for us?
That's right.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We'll end it there. Thank you very much to our panelists, John, Chloe, Kane, and Peter. I think we've had a great discussion. It's a little bit hard to get a disagreement going on here when I think most of the world sort of sees, I think most of the world sort of has a similar opinion around where we're going, but it's nuances that I think we got out today. Of course, need to shout out the our next webinar, which I'll just put it here. So this is next week, next Monday, same time, probably same place. Tim Washington, Christian Hunberg, and Scott Nagar. So if you're interested in talking about hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, or putting our Teslas into our walls and charging and powering our house, then these are the people that you want to speak to. Same format as last time, so you'll get your question answered. And I would strongly recommend you all to sign up and attend. So thank you very much for everyone who came. Thank you to Rachel and Pronia for your help moderating today. Your great help. And just once you end, there is a survey that if you wouldn't mind filling out, it helps us a lot. And we'll take your feedback on for next week. There's 3 more webinars coming up, so stick around. Future Energy Tech on the 31st of August, and Energy Investment and Finance on the 7th of September. We've got a few panelists locked in for those, including the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, Woodside Energy, Tesla, probably. I'm getting a call back today, but most 99% Tesla coming on the 31st of August. So hope to see all you guys there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Well done, Alex.
Well done.
Thanks very much, Alex. Nice work.
Thank you. So, see you.